Welcome, brave souls, to a journey through the veiled countryside, where tranquility masks the true horrors that lurk within. Tonight, we delve into 3 tales that will challenge the safety you feel in the quiet corners of the world. From a Victorian home with a sinister past to the deceptive calm of a remote backwoods cabin, we unearth the stories that make you think twice about closing your eyes at night. In the heart of the forest, where the trees swayed like weary sentinels, stood an old Victorian house, its walls pregnant with the secrets of centuries. This is where our tale unfurls, wrapped in the tendrils of an autumn night, as the crisp leaves whispered of things unseen. The protagonist, Eliza, was a writer with eyes as deep as the ocean and a heart that thrummed with unyielding courage. She sought solitude to stir the cauldron of her creativity and found her solace in the isolated abode, far from the maddening cacophony of city life. On this particular night, a shroud of fog embraced the house, as if the heavens had descended to partake in the unfolding drama. Eliza had always found comfort in the creaks and sighs of the old house, but tonight they sang a different tune. There was a cadence of foreboding that made her skin prickle with anticipation. As she settled into the embrace of a tattered armchair, the typewriter before her clicked and clacked, punctuating the silence with each letter. The fire in the hearth cast a quivering glow, throwing monstrous shadows that danced upon the walls with glee. It started with a whisper. So faint, Eliza thought it a trick of the mind, but then it grew, a symphony of whispers, as if the house itself had found a voice. The flames flickered violently, as though wrestling with an unseen foe, and the temperature dropped, seeping into her bones with an icy caress. Eliza stood, her heart a frenetic drummer in her chest. She called out, "Who's there?" Her voice was devoured by the silence. She ventured towards the sound, every step a thunderous declaration in the hush that enveloped her. The whispers led her to the library, a room she seldom frequented. Books lined the walls, their spines a mosaic of forgotten lore. But it was the window that drew her, where the curtains billowed as though breathing, and there, in the glass, she saw a reflection. Not her own, but that of a woman, her face twisted in a silent scream. The sight rooted Eliza to the spot, her breaths becoming ragged trespassers in her chest. The reflection's eyes bore into hers, a plea, a warning, a curse. She whirled around, but there was nothing. No woman, no scream, nothing but the heavy silence that now felt like a blanket, smothering her. Determined to prove her sanity, Eliza approached the window, her hand trembling as she reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the cold glass, a cacophony erupted. Books cascaded from the shelves, pages fluttering like wounded birds, and a wind howled through the room with the ferocity of a tempest. She fled the library, the house now a maze of terror, the corridors twisted and turned, elongating like the coils of a serpent. Doors slammed shut, trapping her within the bowels of the house. The whispers grew into a chant, a litany of the damned that seemed to seep from the very walls. Eliza stumbled into the parlour, her sanctuary turned prison. The fire had died, the embers winking out like the last stars of dawn. In the darkness she could feel them, the inhabitants of the house, the ones who had never left. They encircled her, their presence oppressive, a miasma of malice. The whispers were now clear, each syllable a serrated blade that lacerated the silence. They spoke of betrayal, of a love soiled by blood. The woman in the reflection, she was the heart of it all. Murdered in a fit of jealous rage, her spirit was tethered to the house, a prisoner of her own tragedy. Eliza's mind raced, her writer's curiosity now a beacon that pierced the darkness. She had to break the cycle, to free the spirit that the house had claimed. Her eyes fell upon the typewriter, its keys a constellation of opportunity. With a resolve that was her armour against the encroaching dread, Eliza began to write. Each word was a struggle, the air thick with resistance, as if the house itself was fighting her. But she persevered, crafting a story of redemption, of release. The whispers turned to shrieks, a maelstrom of sound that threatened to shatter her concentration. But amidst the chaos, there was a clarity. The murdered woman's tale unfolded, a narrative of sorrow that bled onto the pages. As the final period was etched onto the paper, a silence so profound enveloped the house. It was as though the world had ceased to exist, A light, pure and cleansing, emanated from the typewriter, bathing the room in its radiance. And then she was there, the woman from the reflection, her visage, no longer contorted by the anguish of her untimely demise, stood before Eliza with an ethereal grace. She was dressed in the fashion of a bygone era, her gown a tapestry of lace and sorrow. In the silence, her story unfurled, a tale not of ink, but of spectral whispers that wove through Eliza's soul. Her name was Margaret, once the lady of the house, radiant and full of life. She had been the son to her husband, Jonathan, a man whose heart was a well of darkness, disguised by the charming facade of a gentleman. Their marriage, once a portrait of bliss, had decayed into a grim tableau veiled by the facade of high society. Jonathan's heart had been ensnared by another, a shadow that slithered into their home, cloaking itself in the guise of friendship. Margaret's intuition had whispered of betrayal, but her trust in her husband was her undoing. She was a woman of her time, bound by the chains of matrimonial duty and the expectations of a society that deemed her nothing more than a decorative piece in her own life story. One fateful night, as the autumn moon hung heavy in the sky, Margaret confronted her husband. The air was thick with accusation and denial, the ticking of the grandfather clock a metronome to their escalating fury. In a moment, marred by madness and a heart poisoned by infidelity, Jonathan struck Margaret down, her life extinguished in the very home that was her sanctuary. Her body was concealed within the walls of the house, her existence erased with meticulous precision. But while her physical form decayed, her spirit refused to yield. Margaret remained, bound to the mortal plane by the agony of betrayal and the thirst for truth to be unveiled. Eliza, the unwitting inheritor of the house's grim legacy, listened to the echoes of Margaret's tale, her eyes brimming with tears for a woman she had never known, yet felt an intimate connection with. The murder, a spectre of violence that had lurked in the shadows, now stood naked in the light of truth. Driven by a newfound purpose, Eliza knew what she must do. The story she had begun to type was more than fiction, it was an act of liberation. She wove Margaret's tale into the fabric of her narrative, each word a stitch that mended the torn veil between life and death. As the story neared its end, the house itself seemed to breathe a sigh, the very foundations groaning as if in relief. With the completion of the tale, Margaret's spirit was no longer anchored by the weight of her untold story. A look of profound gratitude graced her spectral features before she began to fade, her form dissolving into motes of light that danced upwards, towards the freedom that had eluded her in life. The sun's first rays pierced the horizon, casting away the shadows of the night. Eliza, her fingers still resting on the typewriter, felt a peace settle over the house. The malevolence that had been as tangible as the furniture that adorned the rooms was gone, replaced by a tranquility that whispered of a new beginning. The Victorian house, once a tomb of secrets and sorrow, had been exorcised by the power of a story told, a wrong acknowledged, and a spirit set free. Eliza's heart, though heavy with the weight of what had transpired, was also buoyant with the knowledge that she had been the conduit for justice. Margaret's murder, a sinister thread woven into the tapestry of the house's history, had been unravelled, the narrative completed and the past finally laid to rest. Eliza's role as the chronicler of the unseen had been fulfilled, and in the process she had found a kinship with a woman whose voice had been silenced by time and treachery. The home alone no longer bore the taint of horror, but stood as a testament to the enduring power of storytelling, and the undeniable truth that sometimes the ghosts of history are simply waiting for someone to listen. On the outskirts of a sleepy rural town, nestled among the weeping willows and sighing fields of barley, stood a quaint cottage that seemed to have leaped right out of a painting. Its ivy-draped walls and cobblestone pathway whispered of simpler times, while the modern world buzzed by unnoticed on the distant highway. Miles away from the nearest neighbour, Sarah, a freelance photographer with a penchant for solitude, sought refuge in this picturesque abode. The quietude was a balm for her frayed nerves, a place where the only deadlines were those dictated by the setting sun and the rhythmic rise of the moon. The cottage, with its sun-kissed porch and the charm of yesteryear, was a fortress of tranquility, until the evening the tranquility was shattered. It was an ordinary night for Sarah, filled with the clicking of her camera and the hum of her thoughts, when the unexpected sound of a floorboard groaning under a foreign weight echoed through the hall. Chalking it up to the house settling, Sarah continued her work, lost in the glow of her computer screen. Yet, the silence that once cradled her now seemed charged, pregnant with an unspoken threat that crept along the edges of her consciousness. It was the smell of tobacco, faint but undeniable, that first alerted her that she was not alone. Sarah didn't smoke, neither did any of her infrequent visitors. Her heart began to pound, the sound a drumbeat in her chest, as the once comforting walls of the cottage felt like they were closing in. Gathering her courage, she crept towards the source of the scent, her camera, now a makeshift weapon, gripped tightly in her hands. The air grew colder as she approached the living room, her breaths visible in the dim light. There, outlined by the moon's silver glow through the window, was the silhouette of a man, a stranger, perusing her bookshelves as if he were in a library rather than someone else's home. His presence was a defilement, a violation of her sanctuary. Sarah's voice was a whisper, hoarse with fear. "Who are you?" The stranger turned, his features obscured by darkness, and Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The man's voice was a low rumble, an auditory shadow that filled the room. "Just a traveller passing through." His words were a veneer of civility over the threat that hung tangible in the air between them. This was no benign visitor. The intrusion was intentional, his reasons for being there insidious. With a calm she did not feel, Sarah edged toward the phone. The man watched, a statue with eyes that seemed to follow her every move. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her voice gaining strength from the lie. There was no phone within reach, no cell service to summon help. The intruder's laugh was a sound that would haunt her dreams, a dismissive acknowledgement of the cat-and-mouse game they were now entangled in. "There's no need for that," he said, stepping into the light, revealing a face that was rugged and unsmiling. Sarah's mind raced, her survival instinct in overdrive. She couldn't overpower him. He was larger, likely stronger. She had to outsmart him. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone laced with feigned bravado. "Company," he said, and it was clear from his intonation that his definition of the word was twisted. Time slowed as Sarah weighed her options. There was the back door, but it squeaked, a telltale sound she had never bothered to fix. The windows were too high, the rooms too enclosed, except the dark room. Leading him on a dance of words, Sarah inched backward toward the one place in the cottage she knew was her advantage. "I have nothing of value," she lied again, her back hitting the door of the dark room. He followed, as she knew he would, a predator certain of his prey. "You have you," he said, and that was when she knew. This was not about theft, this was about power. With a swift movement, she slipped into the darkroom, her domain of shadows, and clicked the door shut. The lock was on the inside, a precaution for light leaks, now a barrier between her and the intruder. He pounded on the door, his demands muffled by the solid wood. Sarah's fingers flew to the shelves, feeling for the canister of chemicals she used for developing prints. The acrid smell filled the air as she prepared her improvised defense. The door began to give way, the wood splintering under his weight. But Sarah was ready, her weapon not a camera, but her wits and will to survive. As the door burst open, she flung the chemicals into the intruder's face, his howls of pain a symphony to her ears. Blind and disoriented, he stumbled back, and she darted past him, out of the cottage and into the night. The fields she knew so well became her saviour as she ran, the tall barley a curtain against the pursuit. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs ached, until the lights of a distant truck stop beckoned her to safety. The police found the intruder, subdued by his temporary blindness, still in the cottage. They spoke of Sarah's bravery, of her quick thinking, but all she felt was the shattering of her solitude. The cottage still stands amongst the willows, its charm now blemished by the night of horror. Sarah no longer finds solace in isolation. Instead, she seeks the bustle of life to drown out the memory of the night she was home, but not alone. In the secluded woods of the Oregon backcountry, a quaint cabin stood isolated, a relic from another time. It was here that Mia, a young woman with an adventurous spirit, sought refuge from the constant buzz of her city life. She craved a weekend of solitude, a digital detox to clear her mind and rejuvenate her senses. The cabin, provided by an old family friend, was as rustic as it was remote, with no cell service and only the forest for company. Mia arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows between the trees, the air filled with the scent of pine and the quiet whisper of nature. She unpacked, lit a small fire in the fireplace, and settled in with a book. But as night descended, the comforting solitude she sought took on a more sinister tone. Each crack and pop from the settling cabin was a reminder of her utter isolation. Mia tried to sleep, but found herself attuned to every small noise, her mind playing tricks on her in the darkness. Then came a sound that couldn't be dismissed, a subtle but unmistakable creak from the floorboards outside her room. Frozen with fear, she listened as the sound grew steadily closer, the unmistakable noise of footsteps, deliberate and cautious. Her heart raced. There were no neighbours for miles, no reason for anyone to be out here, especially not in the dead of night. With every option running through her head, Mia reached for the only weapon available, a heavy old flashlight. She crept towards the door, her breath shallow, and flung it open. The hallway was empty. Chalking it up to her imagination, she tried to laugh it off, but the security of laughter in the lonely cabin was hollow. As she turned to head back to bed, she saw it. The back door, previously locked, was now slightly ajar, the night wind gently nudging it open and closed. Panic surged through her veins. She hadn't opened that door since she arrived. Mia's mind raced with survival tactics gleaned from half-remembered television shows and stories. She needed to secure the cabin. She moved swiftly, checking each window and door, ensuring they were locked. But the creeping dread that she was not alone grew with every passing moment. The night stretched on, a canvas of terrors painted with every shadow and sound. Mia sat, back against the bedroom door, flashlight clutched like a talisman, jumping at every crack of the fire and whisper of the wind. Sleep was a distant memory, an impossibility under the weight of fear. Dawn broke with no further incident, but the light of day did little to ease Mia's anxiety. The cabin felt tainted now, its charm usurped by the unknown. She decided to leave, to cut her weekend of solitude short. But as she packed her car, the feeling of being watched crawled across her skin. She scanned the tree line, the dense forest a perfect veil for any number of unseen watchers. That's when she noticed something odd. A series of small, deliberate disturbances in the underbrush, leading away from the cabin. Mia was faced with a choice: leave and never know, or follow the trail. Her adventurous spirit won over her fear. She followed the signs, her steps quiet on the forest floor. The trail led to a small clearing, and there, amidst the trees, was the source of her terror. A homeless man, dishevelled and wild-eyed, surrounded by what looked to be belongings gathered from the forest and refuse from the town. Their eyes met, and for a moment there was a silent understanding. He was as scared of her as she was of him. He'd sought shelter in the abandoned cabin, not realizing it was occupied. His presence was an invasion, but his intentions were not malicious. The police, when they arrived, were gentle with the man. He was a local known to the community, someone who had slipped through the cracks of society, finding solace in the isolation of the forest. Mia watched as they drove away, the weight of the night's terror still heavy on her shoulders. The cabin was quiet once more, its sanctity restored, but the shadows now held a different meaning for Mia. She had sought out the cabin for a horror of a different kind, the horror of disconnecting, of being alone with her thoughts, but had found a very real, very human horror instead. She left the cabin as the sun reached its zenith, the light filtering through the trees in dappled patterns on the forest floor. The experience had changed her, the isolation she once craved now something she feared. The horror wasn't in the solitude itself, but in the realization that even in our most secluded moments, we may not be alone. Mia's story of a weekend alone turned into a narrative of survival and empathy, a reminder that the horrors we imagine are sometimes less frightening than the truths we stumble upon. the cabin, standing stoic amongst the pines, was a witness to this tale. Thanks for watching. To support us, please like and subscribe.